Hello. I realize that it's been a long time since I last spoke to you, and as usual, I've been crazy busy with several things. It's not as though I'm completely relaxed now, but I think I have enough time to talk about something which, again, I think I should be doing now because many of you will perhaps be attending a webinar that I shall be speaking on the 26th. And for once, it's going to be not exactly on gender studies, although me being me, I think gender studies will come into it willy-nilly. But I think it is ostensibly going to be about cultural studies. And I have been looking at a few things that I have in my collection. I have, for example, been looking at this particular book called New Cultural Studies, which I have borrowed from our university library, and I should return it one of these days. This particular book, New Cultural Studies, it is edited by Gary Hall and Claire Birchall, and it is published by University of Edinburgh Press. So I think it's something that you might want to look at. But this is not the book that I shall be talking about today. Today, I'll talk about an essay by Stuart Hall, who is regarded as being clearly one of the stars of cultural studies because of his association with the Center for Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham. But Stuart Hall, I find, had written an essay in 1990, which is again 30 years ago, and in the summer issue of this particular journal called October, which is published by where? Yeah, well, anyway, it doesn't really matter. So in this particular issue of October, Stuart Hall had written an essay called The Emergence of Cultural Studies and the Crisis of Humanities. And this is an essay that I have been reading, and I found the essay to be incredibly useful. And I thought that before I go to actually speak on cultural studies, maybe I should revise my own understanding of cultural studies and what I think it does and where it came from, a very sort of basic history of the evolution of cultural studies. And I really thought that this particular essay does a rather wonderful job. Now, this is not the first time that, of course, that I read Stuart Hall, because at my university till some years ago, I used to teach another essay by Stuart Hall, which is anthologized in the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, called Cultural Studies and its Theoretical Legacies. So that is something which you can find in those of you who have either a hard copy or a soft copy of the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. That is where you're going to find this essay by Stuart Hall, which is very useful. But this essay, I thought, was of great help to me because in the most incredibly clear language, and I think the fact that he uses such a clear language, I mean, you know, it's almost as though that the language is that you would expect to find in a newspaper article. It is that easy to understand. Again, part of the politics, of course, is that I'm going to write in such a simple way, because the fact that he writes in such a simple way is a part of the politics of cultural studies, which is something that I shall come to later. Anyway, so this is a very accessible article. This is a very accessible piece. I don't know whether this article is available online or not, but anyway, I hope that October has a website from where you can download this particular issue number 53, which was published in the summer of 1990. Oh, of course, it is published by MIT Press. So the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Press. So anyway. Now, what is Stuart Hall doing in this essay, The Emergence of Cultural Studies and the Crisis of the Humanities? Now, he is, as you know, he is very, very clear about one thing, is that he wants to when he's talking about cultural studies, he specifically wants to talk about the development of British cultural studies, because he's going to talk very specifically about, of course, what happened at the University of Birmingham. That is what he wishes to do. Now, in order to do that, what I found really interesting is that he begins his history of cultural studies basically in the 19th century. He actually begins with Matthew Arnold. So he says at one point, he says that to understand this dubious reception, you can ignore all of that. To understand this dubious reception is to realize that in the English context, the humanities, insofar as they were ever illuminated by a general statement about program or intentions, were conducted in the light or in the wake of the Arnoldian project. What they were handling in literary work and history were the histories and touchstones of the national culture transmitted to a select number of people. So the fact that he actually mentions Matthew Arnold and he mentions touchstone, those of us who are familiar with Matthew Arnold's sort of prescriptions on culture will know that he talks about his famous touchstone passages, because he says that if you look at these passages, you are going to realize what great literature is. And of course, the definitions. His absolute. He goes into this almost orgy of delight when he says that, what all literature should have is, you remember the phrase, high seriousness. So therefore, all literature has to be serious. Every kind of literature has to have that kind of high seriousness. And Stuart Hall says that that is where he actually situates the history of cultural studies, because that is what Matthew Arnold was doing. Now, any of us would know that Matthew Arnold was writing these essays out of a sense of tremendous anxiety. He was writing these essays out of a sense of tremendous worry, of concern. And what was he so concerned about? He was concerned about the fact that, British culture, British civilization is going to the dogs. And the reason why it is going to the dogs is, of course, because, industrial revolution, people from the villages are flooding into the cities. And of course, there is chance of mass unrest. There is chance of rebellion, there is a chance of revolution. So the peaceful land that Matthew Arnold loved so much is under threat. And in order to ensure that that doesn't happen, what Matthew Arnold basically does is to say, no, we can't have that. We need to culture people, right? So therefore, his project is actually informed by a tremendous worry, a tremendous fear that everything that he actually associated with British culture is going to evaporate, because, although he doesn't use the actual phrase, but of course, I know what he's saying is that, he was fearful that the great unwashed would take over the British cities and British national life, and therefore, everything that is wonderful and glorious and marked by, again, high seriousness is going to go away. And he says that, Stuart Hall says that this particular Arnoldian project is something that is carried on by F.R. Leavis. So then he traces this sort of lineage, as it were, of Matthew Arnold, and then he places F.R. Leavis. Now he says over here that the archetypal figure who inherited that project and who lived it for us in my undergraduate years was, of course, F.R. Leavis. Now, F.R. Leavis is somebody who those of us who are familiar with English literature, we clearly regard F.R. Leavis as being extremely patriarchal, as being, sort of a WASP, something that is famously called a WASP, yes? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So therefore, that kind of a reputation, very old world. I mean, the world has moved so far away from the time of F.R. Leavis. And Stuart Hall says that is what we had. We had F.R. Leavis. It was F.R. Leavis and people like him who actually showed us what is great culture and what is good culture. And he also says that what we really need to understand is that, what cultural studies subsequently develops as happens out of a very conflicted relationship with F.R. Leavis. Now, the conflicted relationship with F.R. Leavis is that F.R. Leavis, so how is the cultural studies people engaging with F.R. Leavis? There is a part of F.R. Leavis that they like. There is a part of F.R. Leavis that they don't like. So the part of the F.R. Leavis that they like is the fact that he seems to be genuinely and very seriously interested in the question of culture, because he understands, like people who do cultural studies, they understand that culture is serious business. Culture isn't just entertainment. Culture isn't just, pretty pictures or wonderful pretty dances. Culture is something that is far, far more important than just mere aesthetics. This is something that Stuart Hall and people who did cultural studies understood. But this is something that Matthew Arnold understood. This is something that F.R. Leavis understood. However, the difference between Matthew Arnold and F.R. Leavis on the one side and people who are doing cultural studies on the other is that that is to say, Matthew Arnold and following Matthew Arnold, F.R. Leavis, they thought about culture as something that was very elitist. So it is a very elitist notion of culture, which is something that F.R. Leavis was trying to establish. And of course, when I was reading this article, I realized, like I hadn't realized before, that this particular idea of sort of culture is something that F.R. Leavis was developing, at Oxford. And so what really happened, and I love this part, where he actually says that, what was really happening is that, nevertheless, Leavis saw himself committed to the project of tending the health of the language and the national culture, of nurturing the refined sensibilities of that small company of scholars who alone could maintain the vigor of culture and cultural life. It was in their keeping, the keeping of a particular literary elite. Leavis himself gives an account of what the conversation of those attending to the cultural life of a nation is like in pedagogic terms. It is an exchange of conversation in which one speaker says to the other, "This is so, is it not?" So therefore, this is so, it is not. So what is really happening there is this sense that F.R. Leavis is broadly saying that he is going to collect these number of people who are going to basically agree that a kind of elitist culture needs to be preserved, a kind of elitist culture has to be propagated, and that kind of elitist culture is broadly going to be the saving of national culture. That is broadly what is being done over here. Now, so Stuart Hall is in agreement with F.R. Leavis when it comes to the understanding that this is what culture is going to be about. What he does not subscribe to is this notion that culture is going to be elitist. Now, that is where he then, when we talk about the New Left, we usually talk about just one period of British history. New Left, we automatically associate it with the 1960s. But Stuart Hall basically gives us two New Lefts in this particular essay. So he says that there is a first New Left and then there is a second New Left. So the first New Left is something that he actually identifies in the 1950s, as it were. So when he talks about the first New Left, when he's talking about the 1950s, he is actually talking about people like Richard Hoggart. he is talking about people like Raymond Williams, and he's talking about people like Edward P. Thompson. So there are 3 books that, of course, anybody who does cultural studies will automatically be aware of. So he certainly talks about The Uses of Literacy by Richard Hoggart. He talks about Culture and Society by Raymond Williams, and he talks about The Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson. So from that, we become fairly well aware of the politics of cultural studies. Yes, of course, cultural studies is heavily influenced by the idea that all culture is political. And of course, we learn that all culture is political from leftism. Yes, so therefore I don't think there is any doubt about that whatsoever. But what we should also understand is that this particular understanding of what culture is, that all culture is political, that again is obviously something that they learn from, you guessed it, the Frankfurt School. So this is where I would want to mention that but I'll come to Frankfurt School later. So what is really happening is that, let me just sort of read out from over here. The attempt to found the Center for Cultural Studies was originally Richard Hoggart's project. Once he was named a professor of English and brought inside the University of Birmingham, what he said in effect was that he would like to continue the work he was doing in The Uses of Literacy, in which he had written about his own working class background. Remember, very, very important, his own working class background and the way in which working class culture was being transformed by the new forces of mass culture. So therefore, the fact that, cultural studies at its very inception, is so sort of, organically political, owes almost entirely to the fact that the people who originally began cultural studies, in a sense, they were not a part of the establishment. Richard Hoggart was not a part of the establishment. Raymond Williams was certainly not a part of the establishment. And therefore, the same thing also applies to E.P. Thompson, because they were all sort of extramural teachers. They were extramural teachers. They were not quite a part, they were not dons in that sense, right? And so that is something that we probably have to keep in mind. Also, when we come to the way in which cultural studies gradually begins to form, we realize that what is happening over here. Now, what is happening over here is that when cultural studies began its work in the 1960s and 70s, it had therefore to undertake the task of unmasking what it considered to be the unstated presuppositions of the humanist tradition itself. So, what we understand by the humanist tradition, that was actually being unmasked. So therefore, the politics. So therefore, when we think about humanism, and I am very often confronted by people, and I'm not confronted by people, but very often people very politely, they come up to me and they say, sir, they know I'm a feminist, and in spite of that, they say, sir, but I don't call myself a feminist. So I say, what do you call yourself? I'm a humanist. Yeah, I'm a humanist. Sir, I believe that it should be about humans, sir. Everybody should be about humans. So when they say they are a humanist, I of course say yes, of course, how wonderful. But when they say they are being a humanist, what they don't understand is that the whole project of humanism was also fantastically exclusionary. When humanism formed as a way of looking at the world, that human was not all human beings. That human was a white European male. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So when the cultural studies began its work in the 1960s and 1970s, it had therefore to undertake the task of unmasking what it considered to be the unstated presuppositions of the humanist tradition. And of course, another very important term that he mentions over here, it had, that is, to undertake a work of demystification, to bring into the open the regulative nature and role the humanities were playing in relation to the natural culture, demystification. So therefore, very recently, some days ago, I'm a part of this WhatsApp group. And in the WhatsApp group, somebody had posted this sort of poem by Robert Burns, "Oh, my love's like a red, red rose." Everybody knows that. And you should have seen the number of academics, even people belonging to English departments, who are sort of saying, "Oh, isn't it lovely? Isn't it wonderful? Now, our studies of literature has become so political. It's all about race and gender and ethnicity and colonialism. Oh, how boring." Wasn't it wonderful in those days when we could actually read a poem and just appreciate its simple beauty? There is no such thing. There is no such thing. I have had many, many occasions on which professors have come up to me and told me, I love poetry, and I just don't like it when I have to explain the poem, because explaining the poem takes away its beauty. And I'm like, not really. Not really. Because when you're actually saying, don't try to understand the poem, just enjoy its beauty. It's so beautiful. You know what you're doing? You're mystifying art. You're actually mystifying art. And that kind of mystification is a kind of an alienation, because what you're basically saying is that I have been given a particular expertise which is allowing me to understand the beauty of this poem. You, however, do not have that expertise, and you will never have that expertise because you are not me. So when I'm telling you that the poem is beautiful, just accept the fact that I'm telling you that the poem is beautiful, so therefore it is beautiful, and don't try to understand it. So there is a kind of a deliberate mystification of art that some of us professors actually try to trade on. And that is something which cultural studies is precisely determined to get rid of. So the project of cultural studies becomes one of demystification. Contemporary cultural forms did not constitute a serious object of contemplation in the academic world, so cultural studies was actually determined to change that. So therefore cultural studies basically said that we are going to now talk more about the way in which contemporary culture is worthy of the attention of cultural studies. He makes a very important point about interdisciplinarity. Now that is another thing, because most of us believe that, yes, of course, it's very important to do interdisciplinary studies. For example, in this era of webinars, we frequently say, yes, let's have interdisciplinary seminar. Okay, wonderful. So how are we going to have an interdisciplinary seminar? Well, get one from history, get somebody from sociology, get somebody from political science, get somebody from English. That's it. You have an interdisciplinary seminar. So therefore, the person from history is going to stay in their own bubble and talk about history. The person from political science is going to be in their own little bubble and talk about political science. The person from English is certainly going to be in their own bubble and talk about English literature or something. And the seminar will be declared interdisciplinary. This is something that Stuart Hall does not understand by interdisciplinary. Listen to what he's saying. He's saying, serious interdisciplinary work involves the intellectual risk. It involves the intellectual risk of saying to professional sociologists that what they say sociology is not what it is. So therefore, when you are doing interdisciplinary work, you are not simply, creating a salad bowl. Right? So America used to once upon a time think of its own culture as a soup, I think, as a mixed soup. And then, of course, they said, no, we don't agree with mixed soup. Let it be like a salad bowl. So everybody is going to have their own elements. We'll all live together, but we won't change each other. And it is precisely the salad bowl idea of interdisciplinarity that Stuart Hall is actually disputing. He's saying, no. The salad bowl sense of interdisciplinarity is something that we don't want. We want the soup kind. where every element in the soup is going to change under the influence of other disciplines. That is going to be interdisciplinary work. So he says that, interdisciplinary work involves the intellectual risk of saying to professional sociologists that what they say sociology is not what it is. But I'm sure he uses sociology only as an example. The same thing can be applied to English. The same thing can be applied to political science. The same thing can be applied to history. So when those academics in the WhatsApp group, when they were basically saying, oh, wasn't it nice in those old days when we could just enjoy a poem for how beautiful it is? You know what they're doing? They are basically trying to say, we are going to safeguard, we are going to police the boundary of English studies. We are not going to allow political science to come in. We are not going to allow sociology to come in. We are not going to allow history to come in. We are simply going to enjoy literature for its, in Hindi you have the term Nirmal Anand. Yes? Pure innocent joy. Nonsense. There is no such thing. There is no Nirmal Anand. There is no Nirmal Anand. It is all politically constructed. It is another matter that we don't want to recognize the politics, and that is precisely what cultural studies does. He goes on to say that what cultural studies also does is how one could think about how one could decenter, or, well, my favorite verb, destabilize a series of interdisciplinary fields. We had to respect and engage with the paradigms and traditions of knowledge and of empirical and concrete work in each of these disciplinary areas in order to construct what we call cultural studies or cultural theory. So therefore, he wants disciplines to be changed profoundly under the impact of other disciplines. That is really what they essentially want to do. He goes on to obviously talk about the Frankfurt School, and he says very, very importantly that the project of the second New Left was crucial. So we've talked about the first New Left, right, which was done, by people like Richard Hoggart and D.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams. And here he goes on to say that the project of the second New Left was crucial, for along with a few other publishers of that time, it translated books not yet available to us. So for the first time, it brought us in English the major works of the Frankfurt School, then of Benjamin, then of Gramsci. So therefore, those of us who think that Walter Benjamin and Horkheimer and Gramsci, they have always been a part of our curriculum and of our academic intellectual consciousness. No, it wasn't always there. It only began to reach the English-speaking world under the second New Left, which means that this is happening in the 1960s and 70s. So therefore, that particular, the fact that we have got Walter Benjamin with us, yes, the fact that we've got Theodor Adorno with us, the fact that we've got Max Horkheimer with us, the fact that we've got Antonio Gramsci with us, all of this is no older, in the English-speaking world, is no older than 50 years. So that is something that we really need to understand. Now, what happens at the Center for Cultural Studies in Birmingham is that it had two practical ramifications. First, a word about pedagogic practice, and the second about how the work was actually done. So he begins to ask this very important question that if somebody came to the Center for Cultural Studies to do a PhD, then he asks this rather wonderful question that, what does one put in the literature review with which all PhDs begin? Because it was a new field. There was no literature to review. I love this part where he actually says that, he says, we could not do graduate work, as I think it is done both in England and in the United States, where the first chapter of a dissertation is a review of the existing literature, which implies that the candidate knows the books, has a complete bibliography, every item of which he or she has read, etc. What was the bibliography of a cultural studies thesis? Nobody knew. So look at the extraordinary risk that they were taking. They were actually inaugurating a field where you couldn't even construct a bibliography. Now you can. Now you can cite everybody from Matthew Arnold right down to Stuart Hall. But then you couldn't. So see how far we have come. So he also asks a very important question, that what would qualify a student to do work at the Center for Cultural Studies? And he says what they would want to ask at the very start is, what are you interested in? What really bugs you about questions of culture and society now? What do you really think is a problem you don't understand out there in the terrible interconnection between culture and politics? So if you can understand these three questions, and if you have answers to these three questions, then you can join. So three questions again. What are you interested in? What really bugs you about questions of culture and society now? And what do you really think is a problem you don't understand out there in the terrible interconnection between culture and politics? So he obviously goes on to talk about the way in which Gramsci talks about producing the national popular, about how it is constituted, and he's constantly talking about the responsibility of translating knowledge back into practice. So cultural studies was heavily influenced and heavily invested in making sure that the knowledge that is produced in the academia does not remain in the academia. So it should be inspired by lived reality, and it should go back to that lived reality. So there should be an interface between what cultural studies does in academia and what and the culture that it actually studies. Hence, the simplicity of the language that I have been talking about over here. It is a very simple language. It is a practice to bring together theory and practice. So he goes on to talk about Thatcherism, and he goes on to talk about the conjuncture of politics. Many of us will know that conjuncture is a very important part of cultural studies. What is conjuncture? Conjuncture is any particular cultural event and the way in which several conflicting forces are held in tension to create that cultural event, right? And if you identify any cultural event, you are going to find that there are several forces that are working in conjunction with it. So therefore, he also talks about the way in which there is a sense of an educational pandemic that has been let loose. By educational pandemic, he basically talks about the way in which people are being less and less educated. People are coming to college, to universities without being able to construct a grammatically correct sentence and stuff like that. And so therefore, there is a tendency on the part of some people to say, oh, you know, this is hopeless. This is hopeless. Look at these people. They can't even write English properly. They can't even speak English properly. And what Stuart Hall does is to say, well, actually, rather than sort of, you know, pointing fingers at them and saying, oh, they can't speak English properly or they can't write English properly, what we actually should be doing is paying more attention to the cultures that they come from. And we should analyze the culture that they come from. We should always look at the politics. We should always look at the structures of oppression that have actually created this kind of student. We should look at the school system. So Stuart Hall is somebody who is heavily interested in the culture as it is in contemporary times. So therefore, when you're doing cultural studies, what you're actually doing is you are looking at culture as it is, again, now. And the way in which something about this particular contemporary culture is bugging you, it is interesting you, it is something that is obsessing you, and you are trying to understand how politics is working in that culture. Only then will you be able to function with some justification as somebody who's practicing cultural studies. So therefore, it does not matter which discipline you draw from. It can be from history, it can be from political science, it can be from geography, it can be from philosophy, it can be from sociology. It does not matter. It does not matter how many disciplines you draw from, but what does matter is that no matter which discipline you're drawing from, you are always aware, you are always informed by the understanding that all culture is politics. And that is something which I think is really something that we have to understand when we are doing cultural studies. Thank you very much, and I'm going to catch up with you again very soon.